In Corinthians tonight. Last week, if you were with us, we kind of studied a little bit of background behind some of the things that were happening to Paul as he wrote not only the letter of 1 Corinthians, but also 2 Corinthians. And I think as we begin this book, I think you'll see the benefit of having looked back there and kind of noticed some of those things, talked a little bit about his travel plans too, and things like that, because it certainly plays a part, especially in the first part of this letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. Before we get into the text itself, though, think about a question. Question number 1 on your handout sheet. That question is, how do you feel when somebody postpones or cancels a social engagement that you were looking forward to? Anybody ever been in that situation before? Anybody awake?
It's disappointing.
It's disappointing, yeah. I was kind of thinking back as probably more disappointing as when you were a kid than anything. A lot of times you might be planning to go over to, your buddy's house, or you might be planning to spend the night with one another, and, you were really looking forward to that, and then maybe your buddy got sick, and you couldn't do that. And that's just kind of natural as a human being to be a little bit disappointed when something that you're looking forward to gets canceled or postponed. I ask that question because what we read about in the beginning of this book and what we know, again, from studying some of the background is Paul was planning to visit the church at Corinth. Actually, I think he was planning to visit them twice as we read about his travel plans. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. What do you think the church at Corinth felt like whenever Paul wasn't able to go and to see them like he'd planned? Well, what if the Apostle Paul was planning to come to Gospel Hill? Let's just put it in this way. And, for, let's say, 3 to 6 months, he'd been writing and telling us about these plans, and we've been preparing for it, and then one day out of the blue, we learned he's not going to be able to make it. How do you think we would feel?
Mad.
Mad? Well, certainly disappointed, right? Wouldn't you say? A lot of times, especially these early churches, you think about Paul was primarily responsible for having established these different congregations. He was the one who went on these mission trips and reached out to people, and he was the one who was helping through a lot of these difficult problems. So it would have been really disappointing on the part of the church at Corinth, and it kind of led some people to look at Paul a little differently, didn't it? And kind of question maybe whether he was an honest or sincere individual or not. And so that's going to be reflected in some of in these first, chapter 2 specifically here. So let's get into chapter 1 here. Again, we don't have time to read these. We're covering 2 chapters at a time, so I'm going to hope that you've read these before, and if not, then you can kind of skim through them as we go. One of the things about these handouts is the verse where you'll find the answer is right beside the question. So I do that to kind of help class speed along in case those haven't had a chance to read it. But question number 2, of course, Paul talks about, troubles and suffering, and kind of remember the background that we studied last week. What were some of the troubles and suffering that Paul would have been going through?
Well, at Ephesus, they were really after him. Really
Yeah, you remember, we didn't mean to interrupt you there.
That's all right, I'm used to it.
We read last week about the riot at Ephesus. And remember, was that a pretty serious situation that Paul found himself in? Yeah, there were some serious questions, and that was a mob like we talked about last week. Generally speaking, when a mob gets a hold of somebody, it's not a very good thing. Of course, they didn't get Paul himself. They were looking for Paul, but they did get a couple of his travel companions. So he does talk about, troubles and sufferings, and one of the things that he mentions throughout here is, God actively, or being active in our troubles and in our sufferings. And question number 2 here is this: how does God involve himself whenever it comes to troubles or suffering?
All things are possible for him. God can raise the dead.
Okay, and what specifically does the Bible teach about the children of God and during their time of suffering? Where's God at in all that? What did you say?
He comforts them.
Yeah, he's there trying to comfort us, isn't he? And so I kind of think about this question, what are how does God comfort us in our times of trouble and suffering? What can you think that some things that God does that help to bring us comfort?
Here's our prayers.
Okay, here's our prayers. And he's going back, Paul's going to allude to the idea of the church at Corinth praying for him and helping him through this very difficult time of trouble and suffering. What else? How do you find comfort in times of trouble or suffering?
Having confidence in your Father.
Okay. Well, one of the things the Bible teaches us is God is right there by our side through our troubles and our suffering, isn't he? So we don't have to wonder, does God know what's happening to me? Is God hearing my prayers? Does he care about the things that I'm going through? Yeah, he does. And that's one of the great promises in the Bible that I think personally in times of trouble and suffering, just to know that God's there, to know that he's listening, to know that he cares and understands what's happening to you, that's a comfort in and of itself, isn't it?
Philippians 4, 6, and 7. I like that.
Yeah.
Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. Peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, regard to our name, through Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So we know that God is there, right? We know that God cares for us. We know that God hears our prayers, and that helps when you're going through a very difficult time. There's another element here that Paul kind of alludes to, though, and I think it's one that maybe we overlook sometimes, or really maybe we just don't think that deeply about it. But a lot of times when you're suffering, it's people who've gone through the same things that you're going through that reach out to you that help bring you comfort. And that's one of the things that Paul talks about here. Part of the reason or part of the good that God brings out of human suffering and trouble is we from our experience, we can reach out to those who are in that same situation that we've been in. And we can comfort them, and we can assure them, and we can try to help them. And we all know, a person, when you're going through something difficult, a person who's been through that same thing that you've been through and they're talking to you, it means a lot more than a person who hasn't, doesn't it? You're more apt to listen, and they're more apt to be able to give you good quality sound advice for a difficult situation. So God does involve himself in our troubles and our sufferings. Did God involve himself in Paul's particular instance?
He said, yeah.
Yeah, that's what he says at least, isn't it? Yeah, he says God was there, and God was able to comfort us through this very difficult time. So question number 3, how did Paul's confidence in God enable him to rise above despair? He even talks about in the first part here of 1 Corinthians 1, he said in verse 9, he said, back up to verse 8. He said, "For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead." So Paul talks about, this to him, this was a life and death situation, wasn't it? Whatever. Again, I think the thing that makes the most sense that he's alluding to, the trouble in Asia, would be that riot at Ephesus. If that's not it, then whatever happened, we don't know what it'd be because it's not recorded in the Bible for us. But that was a life and death situation, or a very, very serious one at the least. And so Paul said, we didn't know. We didn't know if we were going to live. We didn't know if we were going to die. But God enabled us to make it through this difficult situation. And so he talks about, and here's one of the things too that I want to kind of emphasize tonight. The sufferings that Paul is talking about here in the context are sufferings for Christ. things that you suffer because you're a Christian. There's things in this life that maybe for a lack of a better term, we can label them as human suffering. And what I mean by that is there's just some things that are going to happen to you naturally because you're human. It's going to happen to everybody regardless. I don't think that's what Paul's necessarily writing about. I think what he's writing about is things that happen to you because you're a Christian. Things that happen to you because you're promoting the cause of Christ, suffering for Christ. And so one thing that we know, and the Bible teaches us, whatever sufferings and trouble come our way, God is always in control of that situation, isn't he? I liked how one guy put it. I wrote it down in my notes. I'm going to have to transfer this into some of my sermons. But he said, when God's children are put in the furnace, he keeps his hand on the thermostat and his eye on the thermometer. And you think about, temptation and troubles and suffering like that. God is in control, isn't he? And he's never going to let us reach a point where we can't deal with what he's given us to deal with. And you look at Paul, life and death situation, but could Paul handle it? He did, didn't he? And so God is always going to, that we can have that confidence in God that whatever the situation is, it's never going to be too difficult for us to bear or to overcome. So question number 4, how did the Corinthians help Paul through his hardships? What does he talk about there in verse 11? Yeah, they prayed for him. And I think Darrell did a good job of bringing this out when he was when we were going through some of the epistles of Paul, and specifically in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But Paul was never afraid to ask people to pray for him, was he? In fact, I was looking through some of the references, and I counted 7 different letters that Paul wrote, that in those letters he asked Christians to pray for him. And so he was a guy who believed in the power of prayer. And he points out in verse 11 there, you guys were helping us. We were helping together. And sometimes that's a good lesson for us too, because, sometimes when people are suffering and when they're going through some troubling times, you want to do something and you don't really know what the best thing to do for them is. But all of us can pray for them, can't we? And Paul says you were helping us together. It's the idea of all of us were working together to accomplish this job. And we probably don't give enough credit and attention to prayer like we should when it comes to our suffering and troubles, and also other people's sufferings and troubles. But of course, he knew the church at Corinth was praying for him, and he was thankful for it. He said, your prayers have helped us. They helped us overcome this difficult situation. So let's talk a little bit, kind of an introduction there, like Paul does in most of his epistles or letters. But let's talk a little bit about the change of plans that Paul has. Of course, what effect that had upon some of the members of the church of Corinth itself. So question number 5, and we kind of looked at this last week. We might take a little bit of time here and go back and kind of retrace some of these ideas if we can't pick up on them quickly. But what had Paul planned to do as far as traveling? Yeah, and the thing is this, and we kind of read it in the book of Acts, didn't we? When Paul gets done in Ephesus and in Asia, he says, okay, now I'm heading over to Macedonia. And we talked just a little bit about, I think Darrell brought up the question or pointed out in Acts 19 last week, where we were talking a little bit about the length of his stay in that particular area. And Darrell pointed out, I hadn't really noticed it before, but Acts 19 and verse 10, it mentions Paul continued this for 2 years, and all who dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus, both Jews and Greeks. I didn't really, like I said last week, I didn't think too much about it. Hadn't really done much study on it. But I think there's a little bit of additional time that's not being put into the picture, because if you back up to verse 8, we read about that he went into the synagogue and spoke boldly for 3 months. So when he first came there, as Paul's custom was, he went to the synagogue and he kind of worked out of the synagogue for 3 months. And when that fell apart, in verse 9, it says that some, our hearts were hardened, they did not believe, they spoke evil the way before the multitude. He departed from them, withdrew from the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. And this continued for 2 years. So it seems like the 2-year reference is probably to what was going on in the school of Tyrannus. I know I mentioned Acts chapter 20, where he's talking to the elders at Miletus as he's going back toward Jerusalem. But he made mention of that in verse 31, how he, for 3 years, he said, I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears. So there was a 3-month period probably that took place in the synagogue where he worked, probably about 2 years in Tyrannus, and probably a little bit more throughout Asia that he did some additional work. But do you think when Paul, the point that I'm trying to make is this, do you think that when Paul entered into Asia, he thought, I'm going to stay here for 3 years? You think that was his mindset? So why? The question becomes this, why did he stay there for 3 years?
They needed him.
Okay, they needed him. Turn back to 1 Corinthians 16 with me real quickly here. 1 Corinthians 16, and I'm just going to bring this up because, obviously Paul is at Ephesus when he's writing this, or I think at least he is because of what he writes in verse 8 there in 1 Corinthians 16. He says, I'm going to stay at Ephesus until Pentecost. But I don't know at what point in this 3 years that this is when he's writing 1 Corinthians here. But notice what he says in verse 3. He says, when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But it is fitting that I go also, if I go also, that they go with me. Now, I will come to you when I pass through Macedonia, for I'm passing through Macedonia. And it may be that I will remain or even spend the winter with you, that you may send me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you if the Lord permits. But I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a great and effective door has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. So what we learn about that in part is Paul's plan. And one of the things that we learned is Paul was planning on staying quite a while with the church at Corinth whenever he visited them. But he says, there's doors that have been opened for me here at Ephesus. And so 3 years, these doors were being opened, new opportunities were being presented. And so Paul took advantage of those opportunities. I don't think he planned on staying there that long. I think he had a lot of other travel plans that he had in mind, but he ended up staying that long. And so that's important because when we go over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he mentions a couple of things in verse 15 beginning. He says, and in this confidence I intended to come to you before, that you might have a second benefit, to pass by way of you to Macedonia, to come again from Macedonia to you, and be helped by you on my way to Judea. And then in verse 17 he asks the question, he said, therefore when I was planning this, did I do it lightly? Or the things I plan, do I plan according to the flesh, that with me there should be yes, yes, and no, no? Evidently, Paul was planning on visiting Corinth twice. And the question kind of becomes, why didn't Paul do that? Because we only read about him visiting it once on that third missionary trip. And it seems to indicate, even in 2 Corinthians, that Paul's intention was to go from probably Asia and sail across to Corinth and visit them, and then he was going to go up into the Macedonian area and deal with those churches. And he said, no, I'm going to come back. And on my way back, I'm going to visit you last, and then I want you guys to see me out as I, take that collection back to the saints at Jerusalem. So part of the question that we have is, why did Paul's plans change? And one of the most obvious answers to me would be the length of time that he spent in Asia Minor. He didn't intend to spend as much time there as what he ended up spending. And so he had an agenda on this trip. Remember, he was getting the collection and he was taking it back. And so he had to get moving. He couldn't stay there forever. But can you think of anything else as to why Paul might not have did what he intended to do.
I think at different times Paul was instructed by the Holy Spirit as well, where he was to go and how much time he was to spend. I don't think we have all those messages, but we know from like Acts 16:16, like the Holy Spirit forbid him to go to a certain place at this time. The reasons why, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think he was getting instructions.
Yeah, he was, without a doubt, divine instructions, wasn't he? And I don't know that was, necessarily every step that he took, but from time to time, I think there were plans that he had that in places that he was intending to go where God said, don't do it. Go over here instead, or, go here, spend some time there. So that's certainly another possibility too.
It says there's many adversaries.
Yeah.
Was he slowed down maybe by troubles?
Well, he certainly met his fair share of trouble, especially there at Ephesus, didn't he? So, and bring that up, why did he leave Ephesus? Or when did he leave? Maybe I should say that.
That uproar.
Yeah.
It was time.
After the uproar, he left, didn't he? And if you think about it, that's the way Paul kind of operated in a lot of places. He would go somewhere and he'd work, and man, when it started turning the city upside down, he'd already established the congregation there and people were doing the work, he'd move on, wouldn't he? I think it was, to kind of relieve some pressure off the church and Christians and the gospel by his leaving. And so kind of interesting idea. But like Robbie pointed out, there were he mentioned there were many adversaries that he was encountering there. And it could have been the case that some of those people hindered him from doing what he had intended to do. It is kind of interesting if you notice verse 23 here in 2 Corinthians 1. What does he say there?
If God is a witness, to spare you, it did not come again to spare what's happening in Corinth.
Yeah, so Paul gives a specific reason why, at least one of the reasons why he didn't visit Corinth. And that was, he said, to spare you guys. What do you think he means by that statement?
Causing more problems.
What was going on in Corinth?
Well, that's 1 Corinthians talks about the man who took his father's wife and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
That was bad for everybody. Even the Gentiles thought that.
yeah. And there were numerous problems that they were dealing with at the time. Remember, as Paul's working in Ephesus there, Chloe comes and brings him a report. It's so bad, of the thing that's going on. And so I think what Paul's writing about there is if he came to them while they were still working on these problems, he's going to have to bring the rod of discipline, wouldn't he? In other words, he wasn't going to be able to come in and, to have an enjoyable visit. And he's going to have to crack the whip and say, we got to get this done. And you guys got to work on this. And he just didn't want his last visit with them to be of that nature. And so he said, to spare you guys, I didn't come this particular time. I think he wanted to have a pleasant visit with them whenever he did get to go and to see them. So question number 6 is this. How did Paul's opponents use his change of plans against him?
Like he said, well, go. He was already having trouble with apostleship, so on and so forth, and so they're using that to make him scapegoat, if you will.
Yeah, it seems like everywhere Paul goes, he's encountering people who are, questioning his motives, questioning his character, questioning his apostleship. And so I guess they saw this as kind of an opportunity to say, well, that shows you can't trust Paul. You know, he's a guy who says one thing and then he does another thing. But, and that's kind of what Paul alludes to there in chapter 1. You know, I'm not saying yes and I mean no. I'm not saying no and I mean yes. I made these plans. I fully intended to keep them. But he did make an exception. And I want to kind of point that out, if I can find it real quickly. Back in 1 Corinthians 16, we were reading about his plans there in verse 7. He says, I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you if the Lord permits. And so Paul did say, these are my intentions and these are my plans. But like Adam pointed out a while ago, he knew that his plans weren't always God's plans. And so he says, if this is what God permits me to do, then this is what I'm planning on doing. What does that teach you about making plans?
Focus on today.
Okay. And particularly, I was thinking about the passage in James 4, where he talks about, people who said, well, today and tomorrow we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And he said, you don't know what's going to happen to you on tomorrow. What should you say? Yeah. If God's wills, or if the Lord permits, this is what I'm going to try to accomplish today or tomorrow. And as Christians, that should always be our attitude, shouldn't it? Is it wrong to make plans? Is it wrong to have an idea of what you're going to do today or what you want to do tomorrow or even further in the future? No. But we should always have the attitude, if God permits, this is what I want to accomplish. If he doesn't, we'll go a different direction. And that was kind of Paul's travel plans, wasn't it? It wasn't that he was a guy out here who was saying, this is how it's going to be in concrete, and then he turns around and doesn't do it. He's always saying, this is what I plan to do. If God allows me to do it, then we're going to be able to carry that out. So it's kind of interesting just to notice that. So if you go into chapter 2 and look at the first verse, Paul, of course, had visited Corinth before. And it seems like, as you read here, some people, this is where it gets a little bit, nip and tuck, where you gotta take what the Bible gives you and use as much common sense and logic and reasoning as you can. But some people think that Paul made like a quick trip over to Corinth, and it didn't go very good. And so he didn't stay very long, and he left, and when he left, things weren't in a very good situation. And part of the reason that they think that here is in chapter 2 and verse 1. And the question on your handout in verse 8, or question 8, is what were Paul's visits to Corinth like? What does he talk about there in verse 1?
His sorrow.
Yeah, and he uses another key word, he says again, right, which indicates that this had happened before. Surely this wasn't Paul's first visit to the church at Corinth when he established it and set it up. I mean, you read about that, it doesn't sound like a very sorrowful event as what did he spend there? A year and 6 months, wasn't it? A year and a half that he spent there at Corinth. So I don't think, it doesn't make much sense to me that this would have been the first visit that Paul's talking about. And so, is it possible that he made another visit somewhere that we don't know about? Yeah, it's possible. Maybe that's what he's referring there to. When he came to visit them, it was in sorrow. But anyway, a little bit about his plans there. And then in chapter 2, he also talks about a situation that had been remedied from the letter that he wrote that we know as 1 Corinthians. Question number 9, we're looking at verses 5 through 11 here in 2 Corinthians 2. What situation is Paul referring to in this passage as he's writing? Got any idea? He talks about a guy where a lot of punishment was inflicted upon him by the church.
Wasn't that the guy that told him to withdraw from?
That makes the most sense to me. It doesn't really just come out and say, this is what this is the guy I wrote to you about in the first letter. But if you remember back in 1 Corinthians 5, and Dennis kind of mentioned it a while ago, there's a guy who was guilty of fornication, fornication that even Gentiles would have looked down upon. And the church was tolerating him and putting up with him. And Paul's message to them was, remember we studied the idea, little leaven, leaven's the whole lump. Then we studied the idea about the Passover, throw out the get rid of the leaven, purge out the leaven. And so the idea was church discipline. Don't allow this guy, don't have any fellowship with him, don't eat with him, don't associate with him, and try to get him back into a right relationship with God. Get him out of this fornication and get him back in good standing with God. So it seems like this is probably what Paul's writing about here. This punishment that was inflicted upon an individual by all the church. And of course, not to go too deeply into church discipline tonight, but one of the things that the Bible teaches about discipline, any kind of discipline is a sign of true love, isn't it? Sometimes, I don't know where we came up with the idea, well, maybe kids came up with this idea that discipline is a sign that you don't like somebody. Well, a person could administer discipline in that motive or manner. They could be at odds with somebody, and because of that, they do something to bring punishment upon them. But generally speaking, discipline is something that's done out of love. It's something that's done to correct things that are wrong, to bring things back into order, to get a person's life back together. And that's true in about every instance that I can think of, even spiritually speaking and physically speaking. But I think about the discipline that I received as a child. How many of us when we were children appreciated that? How many of us were thankful for it? But I'm today as I look back at it, I'm thankful for it, aren't you? I appreciate it because did it help us? It did, didn't it? Helped us know the difference between right and wrong, motivated us to do what was right, and understood there were consequences if we didn't. And so it's a good thing. And did church discipline work in this instance?
Yes.
Did it help the guy? It did, didn't it? And that's the whole purpose of discipline. It's to help that individual get back on track and get their life right with God. So question number 10, what was this man's reaction to the discipline that was administered to him by the church? How did he react to that?
Sorry.
Yeah, he was genuinely godly sorrow is one of the things the Bible talks about there. He was genuinely remorseful for what he had done. He didn't feel good about it. He didn't feel good about his relationship with God or with the church. And because of that, he repented, didn't he? He changed his life. And again, that's what it's about. And the only reason that a person would change their life is, well, I shouldn't say the only reason, but one of the reasons that a person would change their life is because they're distraught about it, aren't they? They're really concerned and worried and want to do something about their situation. That was the guy that we read about here. So he had repented. He was sorry for what he had done. How were the Corinthians to reaffirm their love for the man that they disciplined? Question 11. Let's just think about it in terms of us. How do we affirm our love for somebody who we've disciplined and they repent?
God, forgive him. We need to forgive him. And to show our love toward him, we need to accept him just as pure as God has.
Yep. Need to forgive him. Need to comfort him. Need to encourage him. Need to restore him, don't get him right back where he was. He's in a right relationship now. He's taking care of things. So, and you think about the idea of church discipline. It wasn't, church discipline isn't a permanent attitude that you're supposed to have towards somebody. Of course, it's based upon their reaction to that discipline, but it's kind of I guess maybe the way to put it would be an interruption in a normal relationship. Because if a person repents, then the relationship that we had with them before go right back to the way it was, shouldn't it? That's what forgiveness and restoration and comforting and encouraging is about. So, question number 12: why is it important for that the Corinthians forgive the man they discipline? Paul talked about the importance of it. What would happen if they didn't?
They would not receive forgiveness.
Okay, that's true. But what did Paul say specifically?
Satan would get advantage of them.
Yeah, Satan is going to get an advantage if they didn't forgive him and get him back, restore him, and comfort and encourage him. You think about the situation that he would have got. Satan, if the church hadn't restored him and forgiven him and shown them that they loved him, that would have been pretty discouraging, wouldn't it, for him as an individual? And so Satan could have got an advantage over him. But Satan could have got an advantage over the church because, like Danny said, what happens if we don't forgive other people? God's not going to forgive us. And you think about what's the very foundation of Christianity? What's it based upon? Forgiveness, isn't it? I mean, that's what it takes. And so we have to be willing to. We want God to forgive us, but we have to be willing to forgive one another too. Paul talks about the idea of being a minister of the new covenant. He talked about while he was in Troas, all the opportunities that came up. But Paul had all these opportunities, and you think about him. Usually, Paul would have been excited about all these opportunities that he had at Troas. But what was on his mind?
Couldn't find Titus.
Yeah, Titus had gone to deliver the letter, interact and encourage the church at Corinth. He was supposed to meet back with Titus at Troas there, but when he got to Troas, Titus wasn't there. So Paul's waiting here, and weeks turn into months, and he's starting to wonder, man, did things not go very good? What's going on here with the church at Corinth? What's their state? And finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Even though all these opportunities, he sets out to Macedonia to look for Titus and figure out what's going on. Any other things you want to mention real quickly? We're out of time here, but
I think anxiety is what he was experiencing, and sometimes I get in my mind that all anxiety is evil, is a work of the devil, and some of it is, but it's just natural to be anxious towards your loved ones if they're missing.
yeah. And Paul was anxious about every congregation that he established, wasn't he? I mean, he was, if he heard something bad was going on there, it's not like it didn't have any effect upon him. So, yeah, it was a good thing. Anyway, we're out of time. You can kind of look over those last few questions yourself. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions?